in conversation with the Right Honourable John Redwood MP of Wokingham. He served as the cabinet of Prime Minister John Major before challenging Major for leadership of the Conservative Party in 1995. He has championed Brexit since his inception to the Commons and has fought for a clear-cut Conservative agenda. Today we shall be discussing current Brexit-related agendas, the state of the Conservative Party, and ways to cut red tape in Britain. My name is Neil Limbu, contributor and commentator for the Bruges Group. Firstly, it's a real privilege for myself to be in conversation with a good ally of the Bruges Group and a well-rounded MP such as John Redwood. Firstly, Mr. Redwood, on education. You have consistently been a champion for more autonomy for schools, cutting Ofsted red tape. That being said, we are currently in a situation where more woke propaganda is shoved down the throats of children. What will the Conservative Party do, or at least in your opinion, do to remove more blatant bias propaganda from schools? As a student like myself, I see this encompassing the woke inclusivity agenda and the increasingly imposed gender and sexual ideology that sweeps schools across the nation.
I do not favour governments deciding what should be taught and how it should be taught and trying to roll out a complete national framework. I think we need to strengthen local determination and school self-government. And the idea of our structure is to have people on the governing boards of schools, both state and private, that represent the wider community and want to have a high quality education of a rounded nature. And it is most important that our schools and our universities are havens of free speech and that they reflect the widespread of opinions and theories that there are about the world we live in and the difficulties we face, obviously excluding those things which are racist or authoritarian and against the law. So we set a general framework of law which rules out extreme views of an unacceptable kind, but then we expect our schools and our universities to allow free exchange and free debate so that young minds can be brought up in a spirit of freedom and contestability of views.
I 100% agree with that. I suppose in the modern day where it seems like one opinion is always correct, it seems like we need to have that culture of freedom of speech, or else what's the point of a society?
Well, indeed, and I think there have been a few blows for freedom recently, particularly at the university level. But I think there are also examples of schools, good examples, where they invite a broad spectrum of opinion in. Because I think very often, if a school or a university attempts to impose one particular set of views on pupils, there will always be pupils or students who don't like that and who rebel very strongly against it. So it may actually be counterproductive. In a relatively free society and in a democracy, it is not possible for one group to successfully make everybody think the same thing. And I'm very pleased it's not possible to do that.
Certainly. We know trust is key between politics and the electorate. We saw this recently with the increasing grassroots conservative movements, such as the Conservative Democratic Organization. A key grassroots issue in the Conservative Party is immigration. One factor as to why Boris Johnson destroyed the Labour Red Wall was the promise of reduced immigration numbers. 2019 was the year that people saw the Conservative Party rightly against mass immigration. But now, with more recent statistics and indications of cabinet infighting over immigration, we saw that during the local elections, that immigration not under control and other promises not made caused the party to desert its traditional voting base. What is the solution to this mass immigration problem? And how can the Conservatives restore trust, not only in the Red Wall heartlands, but for everyone?
Conservative government does have to evolve its policy to be more successful in relation to its very clearly stated promises and aims. The Conservative government since 2010 have always promised much lower immigration than we've been experiencing. And the current administration, recently formed by Mr. Sunak, has reaffirmed that it is too high and that they wish to bring it down, though I can quite understand why he's avoiding commitment to numbers when there is such a big surge underway. But it does mean policy change. We're a generous nation. We will do our bit to accept refugees and those who are fleeing hardship and violence. But the bulk of people coming into our country are not in that category, I'm pleased to say. They are economic migrants who are seeking jobs and come here against the promise, quite often, of a rather lowly paid job. And I think one of the things that came out of Brexit was that many of us want a better model for Britain. We don't want always to invite in lots of people to take low paid jobs to help us out of a temporary labour shortage, when the answer to those issues is better training, more machine power, more computing support, more assistance to employees, so that we can have a higher productivity, higher wage economy using the people who are already settled here. I think it's a great vision. It's one that really the trade unions ought to buy into as well, so that it's cross-party. But I think that is what we expect of the government. They haven't managed it in the last 2 or 3 years, and so it is try harder government time.
What steps would the government need to take now in order to reach that end goal of the promise of cutting mass immigration then?
Well, on the positive side, I think sector by sector, there are all sorts of ways in which government can assist in a higher productivity move. I mean, take agriculture, where a lot of people are brought in for low paid jobs. Quite a lot of that can be automated, and some of the grants that they're currently spending on wilding, I think, are a bad idea. They should be switched to backing those farmers and those agricultural businesses that are prepared to put the money in behind the drones and the computers and the more intelligent machinery, which can assist people so they're more productive and they can be better paid, and better jobs for those at home who don't find them attractive at the moment. And you can do that sector by sector. That's the positive side. And then I think you need to use taking control of our borders, which is one of the big promises from Brexit. And you have to say that we're not going to invite people in to take a job at 21,000 or even at 25, 26,000 a year, where that is currently permissible, that we will recruit people of high skills or people who are coming in to set up businesses or make investments, but that would be at considerably higher salary levels than the ones we're currently engaged with.
Relating to my earlier question on grassroots conservatism, the majority Conservative members and even non-member Conservative voters in recent years have been somewhat undermined by the internal party against authentic conservatism, the ideas of like Burke, Salisbury, and Thatcher. Why is that the case? Surely I can understand the medium of a pragmatic party, yet fundamentally, if you can't hold key issues that matter, such as the free market, low taxation, it makes the Labour Party seem like they have a backbone, which isn't the case at all.
I think the problem set in, first of all, because we had to have a period of governing in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, so serious compromises had to be made that true Conservatives weren't entirely happy about, but it was better than allowing a Labour minority government or whatever. And then I think when Mrs May lost a lot of seats, she then became very dependent on Labour votes. So there was a further drift in order to get anything through the House of Commons. But I think since 2019, when the Conservatives won a good majority in its own right, thanks to Boris Johnson's campaigning at the time, we have missed some of the opportunities, because I don't think we've been confident enough and strong enough to say, yes, people voted Conservative for a reason. They wanted that high wage economy in the way we've been describing with controlled migration at lower numbers, that they wanted a lower tax economy because we do believe that's the way to get higher growth and less inflation, because quite a lot of the tax rises themselves have been inflationary. And so I say to my colleagues, and particularly those in government, be of good faith, be of courage. A lot of the Conservative ideas are extremely good ideas. It's not some narrow ideology. It's a very popular set of proposals because it's on the side of people, and it says that we trust people to do more for themselves, to keep more of their own money, to get on in the world. But of course, the state is there to help those who are struggling for good reasons.
I suppose the people, especially the people in the UK, have always remembered the 70s, the bleak Labour government era of pure government control. They want the freedom. They want low government intervention, I suppose. But the main question is that how can we create that culture now of weaning off the whole system?
Well, indeed, and I think we have a good opportunity to explain to people again why the Labour Liberal Democrat offer which likes some of the things this Conservative government has done, which weren't very conservative and want to make them worse, we have an opportunity to show them how they're not working very well and how if you doubled up on them, they would be disastrous. I mean, let's take the energy sector, for example, which has moved from a very successful set of privatizations, which brought the price of electricity down, which gave it surplus capacity, so you never worried about the lights going off, and which actually cleaned up the industry because it generated huge investment in much cleaner gas replacing coal. So it was environmentally good, it was good for prices, it was good for national resilience and security, the three things you want. In more recent times, there's been so much emphasis on the environmental side that we're endangering national resilience and becoming very import dependent. Silly thing to do because Europe is much shorter of energy on the continent than we are. We have more natural supplies. And it's also coincided with prices going up a lot because Europe as a whole is short of capacity. And then with the Putin war and the need to get Russia out of the system, the prices just went through the roof. And we've now got a very complex system of price controls, subsidies, higher business taxes, higher windfall taxes, destabilizing the wish to invest, leading quite a lot of global investors to say, well, why come to the UK? Because you don't know what the tax is going to be, but it's going to be very high. If you suddenly make a profit, there may be a special tax on it. The controls and regulations are going to be very great and very intrusive. So I'd rather go somewhere where it was easier to do what I need to do. And then that means we get less domestic energy, we become more import dependent, and we're more vulnerable to those price hikes that we've been seeing. So I think energy is a very good example of how a well-intentioned Conservative government can end up with a pretty socialist policy in that particular sector. And nobody's happy because our energy prices are still very high. The price controls now perversely are probably keeping them above what the market set them at. And this great nexus of windfall taxes, now taxing windfall profits when there aren't windfall prices, is deterring the investment we need to have more energy.
A few weeks back, I interviewed Lee Edwards, Director of Facts for EU, and we actually discussed your segment on the retained European Law Revocation Reform Bill. You state that opposition MPs rather stick and rely upon EU statutes and laws rather than doing their jobs in the Commons and making their own laws in our own land. So, that being said, with the recent statute of this law of this bill being shot down in the Lords, what's the steps to take now in order to secure this bill being passed?
Well, the bill needs to be strengthened again because it was, of course, the government which changed the bill for the worst in the Lords. I think ministers felt that they would have difficulty in getting the full bill through because we know that Labour, Liberal Democrat and crossbench peers are pretty hostile to anything that changes European law. But my view was that that was exaggerated because I don't think Labour peers in the Lords want to have a bust up saying they're getting in the way of Brexit improvements in the run up to the election because they know that their party needs to persuade an awful lot of pro-Brexit voters that they are safe again and they don't want to destabilise Brexit. So I say to ministers, as they contemplate this week what they do in the Commons to rebuild the piece of legislation, they should again be of good confidence and good cheer that their lordships can be persuaded to take rather more change in the way that we want. And I think at the moment the bill is extremely disappointing because although we're told there are between 600 or 800 EU measures that are no longer needed and will be removed, most of them have no bearing on Britain anyway. And so it's just a tidying up exercise that won't improve the economy and won't change the way anybody lives their lives. What we're in the business of doing, surely, is improving government, improving laws so that people can do things they couldn't do before, or they can do things they did before better and cheaper. And there's plenty of those that we could do. And so I say to the government, use this opportunity, change some of these laws for the better. Many of them we opposed when they were going through against our wishes when they were originally drafted in the EU.
Would you say that most of this has to boil down to the negativity surrounding the civil servants not actually willing to do their job and actually fight for the benefits of Brexit?
No, I wouldn't make a general attack on civil servants, and I don't work day to day with them in the way that ministers do. But our system rightly holds ministers to account or to blame. Ministers have to get the best out of their civil servants by behaving in a good way. They need to lead, they need to be authoritative, but they obviously need to be courteous and behave in a sensible way towards their staff. And good ministers do those things. So I think we do need more ministerial leadership on these issues. And where we've had a minister who could lead, as with this retained EU law bill, Jacob Rees-Mogg was quite capable of getting it drafted and getting it through the Commons with a big majority. So it can be done. So it made it even more disappointing when the new Secretary of State decided she wanted to water it down so dramatically.
Bit more on Brexit now. A feature of Brexit was Little England, so the idea that us as a nation would be self-sufficient and working for local businesses, families, and communities. Yet, the sort of gist that people have felt now is that more monopolies have been flourishing while we've seen some development in local businesses. However, what most people would say is that it's been a little man's struggle. What is the plan going forward to support British communities against this sort of globalist monopoly tyrants?
Well, good question. And I think the next budget, or even better, next week, if the government woke up, we should have a series of measures in favour of the people you call the little men or little women or both, you know. And I would start with IR35 reforms. I think it's far too difficult to be self-employed legally with the right status. We've lost 700,000 self-employed people, partly over COVID, partly over a set of damaging tax changes which we needn't have made. We want more self-employment, creative, innovative, very good at serving people and giving people that freedom to grow a business. And then with the smaller businesses, now we can make changes in VAT, which we were not allowed to make all the time we're in the EU. Why is the threshold for registration for full VAT still as low as 85,000? There are quite a lot of small businesses that my colleagues report to me literally stop trading for a couple of months each year because they don't want to go through the threshold because of the aggro and the extra cost. And they would expand their businesses by a fifth or more if you raise the threshold sufficiently. I would say you should raise the threshold to 250,000 and you get a lot of extra growth and you'd be on the side of business. But we have had some good Brexit wins, and I think people are too depressed about it. Many of them people who were big shots in the Remain campaign, who are still spending a lot of money trying to persuade us we were all wrong, which I think is pretty undemocratic of them. But you know, we've had our signature to the big Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal, which we wouldn't have got if we'd stayed in the EU, and that is a hugely enterprising part of the world, growing very quickly. So it's good to have that extra benefit of a proper free trade deal, which also can help with services, which is our big strength. We've had a great boom in service exports since we left the EU, contrary to the view that all our trade would be badly damaged, but services are a very important part of what we do. We're obviously saving the maybe 12 billion a year that we were paying to the EU. Now we're getting through the back payments of the settlement, and that is being spent on the NHS. I think we've got to get better at spending it well in the NHS, but we boosted NHS spending by considerably more than the 12 billion, and there is that 12 billion available once we've cleared all the back costs to make those payments. So that is very good news. And something which I think people don't recognize at all is that the EU is now building up a mountain of debt in its own name, you know, €1 trillion being borrowed. If we'd been one of the leading richer members of that club still, that would be debt round our necks. And we're quite capable of increasing our own debt. It would have been disastrous if we had a load of EU debt on top of that, which we really don't want.
100%. I actually did have a follow-up question to debt, but that question will come a bit later. But I 100% agree with you on that matter. It's about how efficiently this government works. I suppose going back with local communities and local self-employed people, they're the ones who are actually empowering the communities. And if we have too much, I suppose, tax regulations on these local self-sufficient employed people, what it doesn't help out the community because no one's going to be employed. It's going to be much more tight and much more rigid. So clearly it's not going to work out. And I hope next week the Chancellor sorts something out.
Well, I would love him to. And certainly hope he does it by the time of the budget, which I think he wants to hold later in the year, as is traditional. But this loss of 700,000 self-employed, I mean, it's there in the figures. And we have a lot of people who are not in the workforce at all anymore. And self-employment is a great way out of being unemployed, and it gives you all sorts of opportunities. And some people do extremely well out of it because they hit upon a product or service that people really want, and then they can expand it into a decent sized business. But for many, it's just a reasonable way of life and a reasonable living. But we've made it too difficult, and the rules are far too tight. And so quite a lot of people can't get contracts from government or big companies anymore because the big companies or government are very worried that they would fall foul of the IR35 regulations. It's safer not to employ somebody who's self-employed.
The European Union's bureaucracy is one thing, but we need to look at British regulations of markets and services, like we've just discussed right now. The first step to take for any Conservative government is putting trust in the individual and not encroaching on communities with red tape. What key legislations or regulations have put certain strains on communities that you know of? And what should we as Conservatives analyze and reform in order to bring back the tools and services back to the people?
I think there are many areas of regulation that are over the top and could be profitably cut back, streamlined, or improved. And if you just take industry generally, we have inherited from the EU a whole set of very detailed product specification regulations. Now, why do you need those? Because it prevents people innovating or makes innovation more difficult, because you have to follow the recipe that's laid down in the regulation. You need a safety regulation. People should have to produce safe products and services, obviously, and that should be strongly enforced. Normally, you would have a law about merchandisable quality. You would say that anyone can set up a business and produce something if it is of merchandisable quality, because that would include safety. So obviously, all food has to be safe to eat, and implements have to be safe to use, and all that kind of thing. But you don't need to tell people how to make them in detail. And of course, what happened in the European Union was a few large companies, often French or German based, helped the EU design the regulation around the products they were making. And it became an anti-competitive device, because then if you happen to be making different types of product to a different specification, but for the same purpose, you weren't able to.
The Bruges Group recently did a study that EU public sector entities had created a culture of borrowing money that created a behemoth of liabilities. We uncovered that 6.4 trillion euros of debt failed to be registered, and a contingent liability around 3.8 trillion million euros of debt. With the EU riddled with debt and the UK being liable, certainly if we remained in the European Union, what would be the case if we did remain in the EU with this liable debt, and how bad of a debt would this have affected the economy?
I think it was becoming extremely difficult to remain in the EU and not be part of the euro, because you had to leave the room when they had discussions about the euro. But it was very difficult to know when the discussion about the euro ended and discussion about the wider EU began, because the euro is the prime driver of the EU now. It's the central success, as they see it, of the whole project of integration. So I think Britain had to make up its mind, and as Britain clearly wasn't going to join the euro, it meant it was much better to leave. But what was happening was that more and more of the debts which they had to incur to get transfers between the different parts of the euro area to try and make the euro work were on the account of the EU generally, not just on the account of the euro area. So Britain was being sucked in to the costs of regional transfers to try and make sure the euro could work, because we had a nasty euro crisis or two, 2011 to 2013, where the fact that the rich northern countries were amassing great surpluses and the southern weaker economy countries were in heavy deficit caused huge tensions within the zone. And there weren't easy ways of transferring the money from the rich parts to the poor parts, because the regional policies weren't big enough and so forth. And so they had a meltdown. And then, of course, the result of that was, as I've just been describing, that they had to put more of the bills onto the wider EU. But if you're not a full euro member, why should you have to pay those bills?
This would have certainly created a bottleneck within the European Union. We saw this with Greece, especially, of how big nations such as Germany, France, and even the UK, we had to pay the tab.
Yes, indeed. And then, of course, also something happened which really shouldn't happen in an advanced country major currency. And that was you could be a depositor of euros in a Cypriot bank or a Greek bank, and for a period you couldn't get your money out. And then in some cases, in the Cypriot banks, you were actually told you could only get half your money out and the other half had been vaporized because the banking system couldn't meet all the debts. Now, in Britain, you never get that because the Bank of England stands behind all the banks and all the money in the system. And so if I deposit money in one city and that city happens to be in deficit, it doesn't mean I can't get my money out of the bank there. And yet that was what was happening in the Eurozone. So it was an extremely difficult situation created by the unwillingness of the successful leaders like Germany and the Netherlands and Austria to share all their money with the rest of the zone in the way you have to do. I mean, in the sterling zone, there are no arguments about London and the main cities of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland sharing the money. That's what you do. We're a family.
So, transitioning much more into eternal Conservative Party matters, where does the future of the Conservative Party lay? We achieved our more nominal feat of getting Brexit done and fighting our way and guiding the ships to the benefits of a post-EU harmony. What is the future fight for our party, and where do you see it in the next coming years?
Well, I hope what will happen is that in the 18 months remaining before a likely general election, we will get back on form, showing that we have the best solutions to having a prosperous economy, to controlling our borders and therefore our communities in the way that people like, and that we will get on with getting some value for money out of all that extra money going into the health service so that we improve the quality of care and the amount of care that is delivered. Those are the three big aims of the Prime Minister within his five, because three of his five aims are the economic aim. So I think if we do that, we have a good case to put to the electorate as to why a Conservative government is better. And if we start reversing some of those moves to socialism in areas like the energy policy, I think it makes the case extremely powerfully, and people will see that were they to then switch from Conservatives to parties of the left, they would be going backwards, that they would be getting high taxes, price controls, too much regulatory intervention, and far from having better lives, they would have worse lives. Instead of having better paid jobs, there'd be fewer jobs. Instead of their communities being looked after, there would be acute housing problems. If we carry on inviting just 500,000 people extra a year into our country, as we have been doing, then you've got to build 2 Southamptons every year with all the houses, shops, public sector facilities people need. And if you go up to the million, which the parties of the left seem to be quite relaxed about, you would need to build 4 Southamptons a year. But nobody's ever told me where we're going to build them and when we're going to build them.
It seems like the more leftward parties seems to destroy the British identity and British culture in regarding all of this, because we cannot simply build 2 Southamptons overnight to accept everyone in. The importing of millions of people would simply just damage the UK.
Well, I just think it's very difficult. And I think it's then not making a decent offer to the people coming in. You're saying to people, will you come in and do low paid jobs that many people in Britain don't want to do? And then you're saying, and by the way, there are going to be extreme difficulties in providing you with decent housing, decent schooling, decent healthcare, because we're very short of all those things. And I don't think that's much of an offer to the people you're inviting in either. So I think we need to be realistic about numbers. And we want people who come to our country to be people that achieve similar living standards to the ones that are around them, and to feel that they are part of a community which can provide enough houses, enough doctors' places, enough school places, enough electricity, enough road space for all the things they need for a decent life.
On the lines of my previous question on the future of the Conservative Party, the present state is what guides the future. We obviously know that. With this in mind, how did we get into the state of many Conservative MPs being quite compliant with everything, as if they were yes course. Clearly, these MPs won the mandate of getting Brexit done. But I suppose the fight is clearly not over with Brexit, especially with the retained European law. So why aren't most Conservative MPs standing up to what is right to Brexit? I suppose this is really on a case-by-case basis with prudence.
I think a lot of Conservative MPs are standing up for their constituents and are standing up for the values and promises made in the manifesto, which won us that very big victory not so long ago. But as you know, in a major national party, there are always disagreements. There's a range of opinion. We are a coalition party, just as Labour is a coalition party. And so not all MPs think the same. I'm always working away to try and get more MPs thinking like me, because I obviously think that would help, but they don't always agree.
Well, Mr. Redwood, you do have the right fear, and I suppose this is a great time to end this conversation. Thank you, Mr. Redwood. It's a pleasure for the Bruges Group to have you on once again.